Hello and welcome to our participants and our audience. I'm Marcus Garlauskas. I'm director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative in the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event, the U.S.-Japan Global Partnership in Central Asia, presented by IPSI and by the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center with the support of the Embassy of Japan in Washington. I expect this will be a very timely and relevant conversation given the strategic importance of Central Asia, how it's positioned between China and Russia, particularly considering China's support for Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Now, before we begin, some quick background on the two Atlantic Council programs that are presenting this event. IPSI, that I direct, informs and shapes the strategies, plans, and policies of the United States and its allies and partners to work together to address the most important rising security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, including the growing threats from both China and North Korea. Now, IPSI is part of the Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, which has the mission of addressing and developing sustainable nonpartisan strategies for the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. And convenings like this one are integral to its mission and to honoring General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service, embodying his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Now, we're pleased to be able to work together on this topic with the Council's Eurasia Center, whose mission is to enhance transatlantic cooperation in promoting stability, democratic values, and prosperity in Eurasia, from Eastern Europe and Turkey in the west to the Caucasus, Russia, and Central Asia in the east. They foster dialogue with regional leaders and key global figures. They provide in-depth country analysis and policy recommendations. And the center seeks to promote an agenda of regional cooperation based on common interests in a free, prosperous, and peaceful future. So to learn more about these programs and the Atlantic Council as a whole, I encourage you to visit our website at atlanticcouncil.org. Now, today we're going to have an in-depth conversation informed by our forthcoming issue brief, The Future of U.S. and Japanese Engagement with Central Asia, which is authored by IPSI's Associate Director, Kyoko Imai, with contributions from other experts. So we've got 90 minutes set aside for today's discussion, which Kyoko will moderate. And before handing the floor over to Kyoko, I want to emphasize this event is conducted in accordance with the Atlantic Council's strict intellectual independence policy. So what you're going to hear today are the individuals' views, not those of their organizations, of the Atlantic Council, our sponsors, or any government entity. And I really want to thank the experts joining us today for bringing their A game and some really in-depth ideas on the issues that we're going to be discussing. So if you'd like to submit a question to this panel of experts, please use askac.org to provide those questions. Again, thank you all very much. And Kyoko, really looking forward to seeing your issue brief published and to the session that you're about to moderate. So Kyoko, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marcus. So everyone, my name is Kyoko Imai, and I am the Associate Director for the Atlantic Council's Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. I'm honored to be moderating today's discussion focusing on U.S. and Japanese engagement with Central Asia. Thank you to the Embassy of Japan and the United States for the generous contribution, without which this opportunity would not have been made possible. For this discussion today, we are thrilled to host three experts on this issue who will offer unique perspectives from Kazakhstan, Japan, and the United States. To provide some background to our audience, Central Asia is a landlocked region wedged between China and Russia, and though it has been often overlooked by great powers, in recent years has become increasingly important geopolitically. For instance, the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine particularly shed light on this region. On the one hand, you have the Trans-Caspian International Transport Route, or Middle Corridor, which has gained attention as a trade network that can deliver resources between Asia and Europe without needing to enter Russia. On the other hand, there are several Central Asian countries that have been complicit in Russia's evasion of global sanctions and even helped fuel Russia's war effort against Ukraine. As for China's involvement, it is rapidly expanding its Belt and Road Initiative, which also encompasses the Middle Corridor. So why is this important for Washington and Tokyo? Despite seeking to compete technologically with Beijing, the US and Japan are heavily dependent on China for materials, as Beijing currently mines 70% of the world's rare earth elements and has a virtual monopoly on refining and processing, a A resource-rich region like Central Asia provides Japan and the United States with the opportunity to diversify its supply chains away from China. Its vast reserves of critical minerals can reduce Washington and Tokyo's over-reliance on Beijing for these supplies, which are most importantly the building blocks for modern defense systems. But strategic as the region may be, it's important for Washington and Tokyo to maintain respect for each Central Asian country's decision-making power and autonomy. For the purposes of this event, we've defined Central Asia as the 5 former Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. While they possess shared goals for regional economic growth, the degree to which they seek foreign engagement, whether it be with democracies like the US and Japan or authoritarian countries like Russia and China, varies drastically. Washington and Tokyo currently engage with the region through C5+1 and Central Asia Plus dialogue frameworks, which allows the 5 countries to amplify their voices on issues of shared concern while also being able to pursue bilateral relationships according to each country's national interests. Japanese engagement in the past and today with Central Asian countries has centered on promoting regional stability, economic development, connectivity, including but definitely not limited to providing expertise on sustainable energy, high-tech training for Central Asia's workforce, and developing critical infrastructure to modernize the region. For the United States, there has been a long history of collaboration with the region, but as we've seen with a transition between the Biden administration to the Trump administration, there's been changes in how the U.S. is seeking to approach its foreign policy with the region. President Trump in the second administration has been highlighting greater business investment and resource acquisition as part of its broader economic competition with China. But we have an excellent lineup of speakers here to provide further insight into these topics. So we will begin and turn it over to our speakers to begin providing their unique perspectives on this issue. As a reminder for our global audience joining today, please submit any questions you have by visiting askac.org. So our first panelist today is Dr. Tomohiko Uyama, who is a professor at Hokkaido University in the Division of Humanities at the Department of Slavic Eurasian Studies, where he is affiliated with the Laboratory of Slavic Eurasian Studies. His expertise lies in Central Eurasian Studies, with his research covering a wide range of topics. He studies Central Asian intellectuals during both Tsarist and revolutionary Russia, conducts comparative research on empires, and analyzes historical writing and Orientalism within the former Soviet Union. Additionally, his work explores contemporary Central Asian politics, focusing on issues such as authoritarianism, conflict resolution, Islamic movements, and Japan's diplomatic engagement with the region. Dr. Uyama, thank you so much for joining today's panel, and over to you for your initial comments.
Thank you, Kyoko, for inviting me to this fascinating event. Before the seminar, I received your question about what are the key challenges that hinder US and Japanese engagement with Central Asia. I would say that the biggest challenge is US and Japan's own indifference to Central Asia. The priority of Central Asia in US and Japan's diplomacy is lower than it deserves. Japan was a pioneer in the 5+1 framework when it launched the Central Asia plus Japan dialogue in 2004. Later, however, Japan became increasingly focused on the Indo-Pacific region to balance the rising power of China. But now that it has become clear that the international order is challenged not only by China, but also by Russia, which is even more aggressive, Japan evidently needs to increase its presence in Central Asia, a region that shares Russia and China as common neighbors with Japan. However, apart from diplomats and experts who engage directly with Central Asia, most Japanese politicians, business people, and citizens still show little interest in the region. And China and Russia's influence in Central Asia has had mixed effects on Japan's engagement with the region. On the one hand, the desire of Central Asian countries to avoid overdependence on these two great powers, especially their vigilance toward huge, unfamiliar China, has served as an incentive to strengthen ties with other partners, including Japan. On the other hand, however, it is clear that Japan cannot compete with Russia when it comes to historically formed human and cultural relationships. And recently, China's enormous economy and rapid technological development have reduced Japan's advantage as a high-tech country. Paradoxically, China has been the foremost beneficiary of Central Asian countries' policy to partially decrease their dependence on Russia since the war in Ukraine began. But I also would like to note that neither China nor Russia has directly hindered Japan's engagement with Central Asia, with some exceptions. And the main reason Japan has not succeeded in increasing its presence, despite its occasional active initiatives, such as the Central Asia plus Japan dialogue, is its low profile in the region's economy, especially with regard to investments. However, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Japanese companies that had previously worked with Russia have shown interest in Central Asian countries as alternative partners, and the Japanese government is eager to support these companies. The first Central Asia plus Japan summit, scheduled for August 2024, was unfortunately canceled, but the Central Asia plus Japan Business Forum was held as planned, with nearly 500 participants, including representatives from Japanese small and medium-sized enterprises. The main areas of cooperation that were to be declared at the summit and were actually discussed at the Business Forum were, first, decarbonization, second, strengthening logistic networks, and third, human resource development. Developing of non-fossil energy is crucial, both globally and for Central Asia, with its vulnerable environment and growing population. Logistics networks are essential for inland Central Asia and also for Eurasian transport corridors that can be used by other countries, including Japan. Human resource development is crucial for the economic and social development of Central Asia, and skilled professionals from Central Asia can also work in Japan. Therefore, I believe these three areas are indeed important for Japan and Central Asian countries. And coordinating activities in these areas with American, European, and South Korean partners could also be useful. Coordinating political affairs between Japan and the US in Central Asia could pose more delicate problems. The US attempts to promote democracy in Central Asia have largely been unsuccessful and have even met with hostility as Central Asians perceived this as interference in their domestic affairs. Japan has little motivation or experience with democracy promotion. However, Japan has extensive experience working with local societies through so-called grassroots projects, and it could be useful to strengthen Japan's support for moderate civil societies organizations in Central Asia now that the US has cut funding for USAID projects. I would also like to emphasize that Japan and the United States should further strengthen educational exchanges with Central Asia. They should not only invite students from Central Asia, but also cooperate in improving educational content in the region. Russia and China use education as a form of soft power, or one may say sharp power, Russia in particular is trying to spread its own self-righteous historical perspective and anti-Western values in Central Asia. This is a dangerous attempt to keep Central Asia subordinate to Russia into the future. Japan and the US should cautiously work to spread a vision of human freedom, equality, and respect for diversity in Central Asia, while being mindful of the region's political landscape and values, and avoiding an arrogant stance. To achieve this, of course, Japan and the United States themselves must continue to be models of freedom and democracy, which unfortunately now seems problematic. And finally, in terms of international relations, Japan has sometimes used the rhetoric free and open Central Asia, an analogy to free and open Indo-Pacific, but has not received much feedback from Central Asian countries. For these countries that actively engage with China, Russia, and other powers, but are aware of the risk of possible interference from great powers, sovereignty is much more important than being free and open in relation to outside countries. Japan and the US should further strive to support the sovereignty, independence, and decolonization of Central Asian countries. Japan is particularly well positioned to do this as a non-Western middle power that can understand the plights of smaller countries. This is what I wanted to say so far. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Uyama, thank you so much. That was really insightful to list out the current challenges that exist, to kind of paint a regional picture of the different foreign partners that Central Asia engages with. And I really appreciated you outlining the ongoing projects and partnerships that Japan has with Central Asian countries, specifically with logistics networks, human resource development, and really appreciated you emphasizing the individuality of each of the Central Asian countries and the need for US and Japan to truly emphasize that and make sure that's not forgotten in its engagement with the region. So thank you very much. Next, I will be turning over to Dr. Zhanibek Arinov, who is joining us on this panel to provide a Central Asian perspective on US and Japanese engagement in the region. He is an assistant professor for the Graduate School of Public Policy at Nazarbayev University. Dr. Arinov's research interests include Central Asian geopolitics, Kazakhstan's foreign policy, EU Central Asia relations, and international identity, image, and perception studies. He is currently working on a project related to legitimacy and delegitimation of international organizations with a specific focus on the Eurasian Economic Union. Thank you so much, Dr. Arinov, for joining today's panel, and over to you for your initial comments on this topic.
Thank you very much, Kyoko. Thank you very much for the Atlantic Council for this event. I am very pleased to be part of this discussion today. Due to the limited time, I'll be mostly focusing on the Central Asian perspective to the US and Japan in the region. And then most of my points probably will be speaking to what Professor Uyama has already mentioned. So it's true that over the last few years, the regional geopolitics in Central Asia has become one of the hot topics, right? All Central Asian countries are trying to diversify their external relations. And then in that kind of context, US and Japan are very important actors in the region, again, to balance against Russia's pressure, to balance against Chinese growing influence in the region. So on the one hand, over the few years, we've been seeing the Russia's growing pressure on the region, especially in the context of its invasion in Ukraine. So of course, Russia cannot hope for the military assistance from Central Asian countries, but at least in two senses. One is diplomatic kind of political support for Russia, directly, indirectly through UN General Assembly, for instance, votings. And second of all, Russia also wants Central Asian countries at least, if not helping directly, but at least not kind of blocking the sanctions evasion mechanism, most part of which goes also through Central Asian countries. On the other hand, Central Asian countries find themselves under the Western pressure of secondary sanctions. That's also one of the key kind of factors that influence foreign policy thinking in the region, especially in Kazakhstan. So in that kind of very difficult geopolitical environment, Central Asian countries want from other actors, especially those actors who are not necessarily having antagonistic relations with each other, who are not necessarily difficult to deal with. So in that kind of context, of course, Japan is one of those actors that Central Asian countries want to develop its relations with. So the second point that I'd like to mention is somehow related to the US and Japan, how the relationship with US and Japan is viewed from the Central Asian perspective. Of course, these two actors are totally different in terms of their profile, in terms of their significance for the region. If we start from the US, for instance, of course, if we compare the United States to Russia's and Chinese physical economic presence in the region, US is secondary in that sense, maybe except for Kazakhstan, where US business is quite active, especially in the oil sector in the western part of Kazakhstan. But other than that, we don't see, I mean, we cannot compare this physical presence of the US and US companies, US business, and US investment in the region. However, being the biggest, the most powerful nation in the world, of course, US has very important significance when it comes to diplomatic and political kind of aspects, right? So in that kind of sense, US is probably the most important actor for Central Asian countries, again, to balance against Russia, to balance against China on certain kind of issues. As for Japan, Japan is a different kind of actor in the region. So I would say that Japan at best probably is a secondary actor in the region, which is visible only in very niche kind of sectors. So we don't see in Central Asia, Japan, again, being proactive, Japan being kind of investing a lot, Japan being present in the region. So, however, as Professor Uyama mentioned, Japan is very active in certain very specific sectors, which are very important for these countries as well, but maybe sometimes not necessarily acknowledged or noticed by wider public or by wider actors, right? So, of course, there are certain challenges that the US and Japan both face in the region. So I would say that probably one of the issues is that both for Japan and the US, Central Asia is not the immediate the region of immediate interest, right? It's very distant from them, so it's far away. In that sense, both US and Japan foreign policies have been reactive to certain events external to Central Asia. So in that sense, especially I'm more familiar with the US policy in the region rather than Japan. But for instance, if we take the US, from Central Asian perspective, it seems that the Central Asia for the US doesn't have its own separate agency. So Central Asia is always an extension of something for the US foreign policy. So for decades, it has been the extension of Afghan problem. It disappeared, the US interest waned, and now the US is paying even more attention to the region again, not because the Central Asia itself as a region important, just because US needs to contain China, US needs to contain Russia. So in that kind of sense, I think the US agenda in the region seems to be a bit kind of negative. So that's how it's mostly viewed in the region. So, and then of course, the US, we will talk a lot about the US soft power attraction, but we have to also acknowledge that the level of anti-Americanism in the region is also high when it comes to the public perceptions of the US due to various reasons. Some of them part of the Russian propaganda, Chinese propaganda. Others relate directly what the US has been doing in neighboring regions. For instance, the war in Iraq or what's been happening in Palestine more recently, those things are kind of significantly add up to the negative perception of the US on the wider public. So those are the restrictions that the US face. When it comes to Japan, Japan is again one of the countries admired in the region. One of the countries at the start of this country's independence, which were kind of taken, which was taken as an example. So Japanese miracles, so Japanese quality, Japanese discipline, and all this kind of stuff are always admired in the region. So that probably can be one of the strengths that the Japan has in the region. So maybe I just kind of few points related to what could be done, could have been done, for instance, in terms of US and Japan engagement in the region. So I think one important thing would be, again, having this understanding the strategic vision that Japan and the US have towards the region. So very often, again, because of this different extra regional developments, it's really difficult sometimes to grasp the strategic vision that these two countries have towards the region. Again, probably part of the problem is the distance between the Central Asia and Japan and the US. Probably that's one of the problems. But having this clear strategic vision, what the US wants in the region, what Japan wants in the region, how they portray themselves, how they position themselves, and what is expected from this kind of cooperation between US, Central Asia, or Central Asia and Japan. I think those kind of clear articulations of those narratives would help a lot, at least at the expert level, to understand better the expectations and so on and so forth. Second, I would say probably it more relates to the US, but to a certain extent to Japan as well. Avoiding the zero-sum framing of the interaction in the region is extremely important for regional countries. So the Russia and China are there to stay as main partners in the region, for Central Asia. There is no way that Central Asian countries can close the border with China or Russia and all this kind of stuff. There are so many things. It's a part of the bigger discussion that we're having in Kazakhstan as well. But when the US, for instance, comes, or US vice presidents travels to the region and immediately criticize heavily China, so that doesn't kind of add to this positive agenda of US and Central Asia interaction. So we understand that the US may have their own agenda in the region, but at the same time, framing that in a negative zero-sum kind of thinking actually doesn't help much for the increasing bilateral or multilateral relations with the region. So that kind of avoiding zero-sum game framing would be one benefit, I guess. And then Central Asian countries are trying to resist some of those pressures coming, for instance, from Russia most often, but at a certain point from China. So through developing regional cooperation, so C5+1 formats have become quite important. But beyond that, we also have this intra-regional cooperation growing quite significantly over the last few years. So the support for this kind of multilateral regional kind of cooperation would be in the interest of the US and Japan, again, to increase the agency of the region vis-a-vis Russia at this point, maybe later vis-a-vis China. So again, Japan was the pioneering country to start this C5+1 format back 20 years ago. And of course, there is potential for US and Japan cooperation in the region. So probably we cannot think of these two countries as big powers, the main dominant kind of players in the region, but there are certain niches, certain kind of sectors where the cooperation between these two countries could also be beneficial for them, but also elevate Central Asia's agency and kind of decrease the dependence on China and Russia. So again, some of those sectors have been mentioned already. Decarbonization, energy transition, rare earth metals, minerals, support to the infrastructure projects in the region. So those are and then of course, humanitarian, educational, cultural kind of contexts are also important, human capital. So those are the areas where we could potentially see more interaction between Japan and the US and together with Central Asian countries. So I'll just stop here. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take those. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Arinov, thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful in outlining what is currently going on in Central Asia and how Russian, Chinese, Japanese, and US engagements are viewed, and being able to drill down on how these engagements are viewed by the region, and then what you see as niche sectors that we can focus in on for Japan and US to increase engagement, but then not forget about Central Asia's own agency. I think that's really important rather than seeing it as just a convenient way to be an extension of other events that are happening around the world. So thank you so much. That's really helpful framing, and I'm sure we will dig into this further once we get into the moderated section of this discussion. But now I am going to turn it over to Andrew Denieri. I'm really excited to have him here. He is the Associate Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, where he spearheads their Central Asia programming. He also facilitates the Eurasia Center's work on Ukraine and Russia, including, but certainly not limited to, overseeing the Russia Tomorrow paper series and work on Ukraine's reconstruction and business and governments in Eurasia. Prior to joining the council, Andrew taught English at a maritime academy in southern Ukraine as a Peace Corps volunteer, studied Russian in St. Petersburg, and as part of Eurasia Foundation's Young Professionals Network. Really eager to hear your thoughts, Andrew, specifically on U.S. engagement, what it looks like now, and the future of U.S. engagement with Central Asia. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Kyoko, and it's really a pleasure to be co-sponsoring this event with IPSI from the Eurasia Center side. This is a great partnership, and I hope we can do a bit more going forward. And thanks to our other panelists here. It's great to meet you as well and hear your perspectives. So I'll do my best to be brief here so we can make this a dynamic discussion and get into the moderated Q&A and the audience Q&A. I think we heard Mr. Arinov talk about maybe the current state of U.S. involvement and the U.S. approach to Central Asia, and I'll maybe try to look at the future and I think some changes that we're seeing, especially as we have a new generation of Central Asia specialists kind of coming of age or about to come of age here. So the U.S. in general has an interest in stability and prosperity in Central Asia through more open, diversified economies and trade routes in particular. For many years, U.S. interests were largely confined to hydrocarbon extraction and counterterrorism. And while those are, still absolutely important parts of the relationship, I think there's now an opportunity to help be a guarantor of Central Asian states' independence and regional cooperation, and to provide an outlet for more varied economic goals and be an economic partner in the region. And to Mr. Arinov's comments, I think we're starting to see Central Asia be a priority for the U.S. on its own, not as much tied to Russia, to China, or to Afghanistan. Those are certainly a part of the approach, but I think it's becoming not the only part of the picture. And so just to run through some of the things that I think we can get into later and what I think can make up a more robust, more vital U.S. Central Asia relationship. These are rare earth and critical mineral development, bulk and containerized trade across the Caspian as part of the Middle Corridor, physical and soft infrastructure projects for connectivity, helping to mature capital and stock markets in the region, and the development of light industry and high-tech enterprises. And these are things that would mobilize not only U.S. government involvement, but also American firms, capital, and credit. And on the stability side, counterterrorism absolutely remains an issue of shared interest, especially in the region of border security. And I want to just shout out quickly the Central Asian states, particularly Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, for resolving their territorial claims within the past year. That's a very welcome step and a step toward greater stability in the region. Talking about challenges here, I mean, we have to be honest that there are some really big ones. Namely, I think the U.S.'s geography relative to Central Asia and Central Asia's geography relative to Russia and China. Central Asia is physically distant and culturally distinct from the United States. Like, that is just something that will always, I think, be true, and that puts some natural impediments on the relationship and presents obstacles that need to be overcome. It just requires a little bit more energy, a little more cooperation to see the relationships that we want to see. And then for the Central Asian states, their borders with Russia and China to the north and to the east are not going to change. There's also Afghanistan and Iran to the south and the southwest. This is a very difficult neighborhood with overbearing and unstable neighbors, so it can be difficult to launch the kind of diplomatic and economic projects that, we might all like to see kind of a priori. Things are just very complex, especially considering how Russia and China have decided that they want to be militarily aggressive and revisionist powers in the international system and not necessarily the cooperative great powers that we might all like to see. That makes it more difficult for the Central Asian states to grow ties with the US. We also need to be honest that there are challenges that are endogenous to Central Asia in the US relationship here. I think the United States and European partners would have liked to see more progress made on democracy and on open markets over the last 30 plus years. There have been concerns about human rights, free speech, religious freedom, and corruption. But that's true in many parts of the world as well. And I think the relationships have matured in such a way that we can talk about these things in a constructive dialogue, not only with governments, but also with civil society and the private sector. And kind of to wrap up a little bit here, some of these potential roadblocks are actually opportunities. The Central Asian states see strategic risks in an over-reliance on Russia and China. And the region's leaders, in particular Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, are really energetically seeking out new partners, not only for diplomatic relations, but also out of pure economic and national security self-interest. And it's these areas of potential cooperation and mutual benefit that I think warrant an expansion and a deepening of US relations with the Central Asian states. So there's a lot that the US can bring to the Central Asian states to make them more prosperous and more secure. And in return, I think the Central Asian states, these are fast growing countries and economies. There's a lot of shared economic value that we can get out of these relationships. And then also the byproduct of what I hope we'll see in the relationship will also be governments in Central Asia feeling more confident in building freedoms for their citizens as well across the region. So to sum up, the relationship right now is okay. There's a lot the US can do to be a more constructive partner. And I think we are seeing a change in that direction, but it's going to require some more energy and some more investment as well. And happy to discuss all these in more detail in the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew. Really appreciated how you tied in to Dr. Arinov's laying out how there have been issues or challenges in U.S. engagement in Central Asia in the past, but I love how you took a positive view and outlining specific issue areas which the U.S. can expand on Central Asian engagement going forward. So now I'd like to turn it over to the moderated discussion. And so we have a number of questions that have already come in through our askac.org platform online. But for our global audience, a reminder to please submit any questions you have for our panelists so that I can make sure to get them addressed to our panelists. So I have a number of questions that I'd love to ask you all. So let's just jump right in. So building on the comments that you all already laid out, Andrew, I'd love to turn to you first. You kind of talked a little bit about U.S. presence in Central Asia in the past and then what can happen in the future. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you see the current Trump administration's what's often called the transactional foreign policy. How does that differ from how the U.S. has engaged in the past? I know you mentioned that previously the U.S. has kind of emphasized democracy, human rights, and free speech, which has had varying degrees of success or pushback from Central Asia, and that has, as Dr. Arinov pointed out, sometimes been viewed negatively as trying to impose a system onto Central Asia. So how do you see the future of the Trump administration and its foreign policy towards the region?
So the Trump administration's, so-called transactional approach to foreign relations can get a bad rap, and in some corners of the world, I think that maybe is more warranted. But I think in Central Asia, this is maybe the region where that approach can actually provide the most significant gains in the relationship, thinking very pragmatically about how to do deals and how to strengthen our relations. And just talking about President Trump, he very clearly sees himself as a deal maker and a peacemaker. We'll all eyes after this, I'm sure, will be on Anchorage, Alaska, in a little bit here. But I think that approach doesn't super bother the Central Asian governments, because if you think about how these countries have had to define themselves and their sovereignty and pursue stability and prosperity over the last 30 plus years, you know, in such a difficult neighborhood of the world, extracting maximum benefit out of relations with Russia and China while preserving their sovereignty, combating transnational drug traffickers and terrorists with multiple partners, having to worry about a nuclearizing Iran and managing difficult politics and relationships between each other. There's a very, I think, pragmatic attitude and an openness to deal making and dealing directly that is actually can be appealing to the Central Asian states in President Trump's approach to the region, his administration's approach. So I think the approach doesn't necessarily spook the Central Asian states the way it might in other parts of the world. Talking in particular about the relationship, the Trump administration has made a really big deal about rare earths and critical minerals and developing resilient supply chains that don't include China, just because we ourselves have an over-reliance on China, in particular for refining and processing of these metals and materials. And the Central Asian states are quite rich in many of these, in particular Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which, by the way, Secretary Rubio has already conducted high-level dialogues with the foreign ministers of both of these countries, in which critical minerals and rare earths have been a significant part of those conversations. So I think that's one space to watch, and there's lots of practical steps that the Trump administration can take to make these projects more viable from a U.S. private sector perspective. Not only financing, but things like helping conduct geological surveys from the U.S. Geological Service. And I think it would be helpful for the Kazakh and Uzbek governments to work together with the U.S. on that. And then number two, these are by and large high growth frontier markets where the quality of U.S. investment can provide long-term benefits to the Central Asian states and relatively quick return on investment to U.S. companies. The fundamentals are there. These are economies growing, in particular Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, 5+%, and with growing populations as well. So I think the U.S. government, it's incumbent on the Trump administration to help make project economics work to facilitate some of these potential deals, financing, filling in credit gaps, and all sorts of these things, and engaging with governments to make the private sector investment more viable, because the fundamentals are there, but we need to overcome some of these smaller but important logistical challenges in order to unlock that kind of capital and credit that the Central Asian states absolutely want to see. And if we're talking about a transactional U.S. government approach, that's something the Trump administration wants to see as well.
Andrew, thank you so much. That was really insightful and a lot for us to think about. I'd like to transition over to Dr. Arinov. So Andrew kind of laid out a couple of individual Central Asian countries, particularly Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, where the United States has already seen political diplomacy at play and has already seen high-profile meetings happening bilaterally between the United States and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So I'm curious if you can dig into and kind of explain for our audience here how the five Central Asian countries differ in how they view US and Japanese engagement. So there are certainly huge differences between whether countries are even looking to enhance engagement, or whether they're more looking to remain connected primarily with Russia and China. So would love if you could kind of dig into how the different countries differ in their approach and how they want to, whether they want to, or in what areas they see potential relationships with foreign partners.
Right. Thank you for the question. Definitely, when we talk about Central Asia, we are talking about 5 countries, which are I mean, which share some similarities in terms of their economy. The political systems are more or less close to each other, historical background, language, culture, but at the same time, there are significant differences between them when it comes to economic level of economic development, the structure of their relations with external powers, including US and Japan. And there is natural competition among those countries as well for attention, for infrastructure, for investments, for trade, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, of course, when we talk about Central Asia as a region, we kind of downgrade the differences and kind of specificities of those 5 countries. When it comes to individual countries and their relations with US and Japan, I would probably say that Kazakhstan has the most advanced relations with the US when it comes to political, diplomatic engagement, as well as economic, because Kazakhstan having this vast shares of natural resources, especially oil and gas in the western part of Kazakhstan, and the US big companies have been the traditional investors in the region, in the oil sector in Kazakhstan. In terms of political diplomatic kind of relations, again, Kazakh president is the one who travels the most frequently to the US. Back in the 90s, Kazakhstan was one of the key countries for the US because of the nuclear disarmament issue in the country. So there was huge attention to Kazakhstan in the 90s. So in that kind of respect, probably Kazakhstan would be the biggest country in terms of this kind of dynamics. When it comes to Japan, probably Professor Uyama has more to say on this. Probably seems to be more active in Uzbekistan and provide certain kind of development assistance to Kyrgyzstan mostly, and then in Tajikistan to a certain extent. In Kazakhstan also, Japan just couple of weeks ago decided to provide some support to in the western part of the country in Kazakhstan, development assistance to help the survivors from this nuclear test that we hosted back in the Soviet Union in the eastern part of Kazakhstan. So Uzbekistan is another big country in the region. I would argue that probably Uzbekistan is more resilient to Russian and Chinese pressure among all 5 Central Asian countries because it doesn't share a direct border neither with Russia nor with China. It has the biggest population, 35 million. Kazakhstan has 20, for instance, the second biggest country in terms of population. And Uzbekistan is strategically positioned among those 4 countries plus Afghanistan in the middle of the region. So in that sense, if we are talking about Central Asia, we are necessarily talking about Uzbekistan. Without Uzbekistan, any kind of regional cooperation or regional engagement with other countries seems highly problematic. And Uzbekistan, the current president of the country, Mirziyoyev, has adopted a different kind of foreign policy approach, which is about openness, embracing the investments, opening up the country, the borders, liberalizing economy. So in that sense, we see a huge development boom, economic development boom in the country. And then, as Andrew has already mentioned, if I may, has already mentioned, Uzbekistan also has huge natural resources, especially when it comes to rare earth elements. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are comparatively smaller. They are a bit less developed in terms of their economy. So Kyrgyzstan has been traditionally considered as more democratic in the region, but now there are also discussions about the extent of democracy that the changes that they have seen in the past 5 years. Turkmenistan, the biggest gas exporter in the region, the official position is positive neutrality, is very suspicious to any kind of active foreign policy, including within the region. So Turkmenistan is one of those the country which is the most difficult to deal with, even when it comes to the intra-regional cooperation. So probably this is the kind of overview, but definitely when we speak about Central Asia, we have to keep in mind that those 5 countries are different in terms of their policies, in terms of their development, in terms of their structure of their relations, and they compete for that attention. For instance, there is a competition between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan in terms of attracting transportation routes, investments, and so on and so forth. So this also needs to be kept in mind. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Arinov. I think a key theme throughout today's discussion from all the speakers is that Central Asia is not just a region. There are 5 different countries with different unique identities and unique perspectives on wanting to engage with foreign partners. So it really important to not lose sight of what each of these countries brings to the table and what the degree to which they want to engage with partners, and how the US and Japan should shape and frame the engagement and the strategy when they're wanting to conduct either multilateral or bilateral engagements with each of those countries. So I kind of want to turn it over to Dr. Uyama because we talked a little bit about Japan in the previous question. And so I think, Dr. Uyama, at the start of your prepared remarks, you mentioned the US and the realistic nature that US aid has unfortunately lost a lot of funding, and so development projects funded by the United States have been reduced significantly, including in Central Asia. So I'm wondering if this is a key opportunity for Japan to really ramp up its infrastructure support development assistance. We know that JICA has had partnerships throughout the globe on infrastructure and development assistance projects. So what Japanese engagement is happening in the region now, but what more can Japan do, considering the reality that the US is reducing development support in the current administration?
Well, in the situation with the US assistance is very complicated, and Japan has provided assistance to Central Asia in more technical spheres, such as human resource development and technical assistance, and also providing various educational and medical facilities and so on. So what USAID has done in Central Asia is quite different from Japan's profile. But I think, as I said before, based on Japan's experience in working with local societies, Japan can strengthen its relations with civil society in Central Asia. And now NGOs and independent media are in a difficult situation in some Central Asian countries. So Japan can do more to work with them. But I want to also say that what Japan's assistance did before was based on the fact that Central Asia was less developed countries before, but now Central Asian countries has quite well developed in terms of economy, and also earlier many people in the world said that Central Asia was a unstable region with international terrorism and border conflicts and so on. But now we see that Central Asia is one of the most stable regions in the world. So we have to acknowledge that Central Asian countries are now equal partners with more developed in countries, and Central Asian countries have enough agency and initiatives in terms of diplomacy. Even in the first years of independence, Kazakhstan and other countries had many ideas of working with of creating regional cooperation structures, and yeah, so and they also value multilateralism centered on the United Nations. So I think Japan and the United States should support more the initiatives, diplomatic initiatives of Central Asian countries to enhance multilateralism, which contribute to peace and stability in this region and the world.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Uyama. And I want to kind of build off of what you were saying about the ways that the US and Japan can develop diplomatic initiatives using multilateralism and to enhance regional cooperation structures that exist. I see a question from the audience that I'll read here. It says, this region has always been low in transparency and rule of law, precluding serious foreign investment due to risk. What workarounds or security guarantees can these states offer besides allowing private security to occupy and protect foreign investments like rare earth mining facilities? So I think all of you on this panel spoke about the importance of rare earth mining facilities and potential for increased economic investment by both the United States and Japan. But the reality is that there are risks due to a lack of transparency and rule of law in the region. So I'd like to ask all of you on this panel, what can we do about the inherent risks that still remain in Central Asia that pose a problem for potential US and Japanese private sector that are seeking to enhance investment in the region? So what can we do about that? So I'll turn it over to Andrew first, if you don't mind, and then we can turn it over to our other speakers.
Sure, happy to take the first cut at this because I think there's a lot in this question. The unfortunate thing is my understanding is that the U.S. is deprioritizing exactly this a little bit, at least from a government perspective. But we should also note that this is not something that's even across the region. Some countries have made strides to address these concerns, in particular Kazakhstan with the Astana International Financial Center, which is based on British common law, is a place where companies can register and be subject to essentially British law and courts in a much more transparent way than they might otherwise be. Uzbekistan is also making some strides to reform some of their opaque, I would say, processes. And then there's less concern for this in places like Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. But I think the main thing is that the US actually has a good bit of leverage here in the form of its economic power and the potential for investments. If the US shows that it's a serious potential economic partner, then that will motivate many of these states to do the kinds of opening, the kinds of reform efforts that we might like to see that would unlock these sorts of investments and make it easier for the US private sector to engage. And so perhaps a first step, kind of like I mentioned, would be for a US geological survey, if we're talking about mines, to go to the region and work with the geological services of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to outline, more accurately what is out there, because some of these maps are quite outdated. And then take that as an initial or even an intermediate step toward investment once we know kind of what we're looking at in the ground, that then there'll be more interest from US companies having more certainty about what the prospects are in terms of the actual minerals and metals in the ground. And then that's something that the US government, in conjunction with the US private sector, can work with these governments on of, hey, here are the kinds of guarantees, here are the steps we'd like to see, and work together to build the investment frameworks that will actually facilitate this kind of investment.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for your thoughts there. Dr. Arinov, let's turn to you for your comments on this question.
Yeah, sure. So I don't have much to add to this. So unfortunately, yes, the absence of rule of law, the quality of governance, the level of corruption remain the key barriers for one of the key barriers for foreign investment in the region. And then from time to time, quite regularly, we hear how kind of international investors lose their money, their projects in Central Asian countries due to some kind of very questionable kind of actions by the governments or by local oligarchs or the groups affiliated with the government. So those things happen quite regularly, and I do believe truly that that's probably one of the main reasons why we don't see much kind of interest in investing in Central Asia, especially, I mean, big companies, I guess, are fine. When you have these big transnational corporations investing into the region, they are more secure because very often they are powerful, very often they are protected. But when we're talking about smaller size investors coming to the region, they don't have the same level of protection or same level of context or same level of, I don't know, the backing by national governments and so on and so forth. So that's a really big problem. And despite some of the changes or the policies that the countries in the region have adopted or have announced, at least in the last 10 years, to me, the things haven't changed dramatically to the positive side. Yeah, this is still something that the governments need to pay attention very closely if they want more investors, more investments, and more businesses operating in the region.
Thank you, Dr. Arinov. And I'd like to turn to Dr. Uyama. I think Japan has, for instance, JICA has partnered with the World Customs Organization to provide training to Central Asian customs officers to help facilitate legitimate trade and intercept smuggling and fraud, and trying to enhance customs risk management. So I think that's one way that Japan has tangibly helped to improve Central Asian transparency, rule of law, and economic freedom. So, Dr. Uyama, I'm curious if you have any potential potential opportunities for Japan to kind of help with improving Central Asian rule of law and transparency economically here.
Well, you're right that JICA has various programs which trains Central Asian bureaucrats, and it is said that these programs are attractive and effective, but it cannot change the overall picture of political and administrative system that lacks transparency. So, of course, there are many problems, including corruption, but on the other hand, the governments, especially of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, have tried much to improve the situation, and well, improvement is there. So in Japan, the corruption and the lack of transparency in Central Asia has often been exaggerated. But I think the province is roughly on the average level of developing countries in the world. So another problem is that how to say, business practice in which plans are very often changed and contracts are canceled and so on. So this is a kind of cultural problem. So of course there are many problems, but I think this is not this should not be the reason not to engage business in Central Asia.
Absolutely, completely agree that there are realities of corruption, of low transparency, and limits to the rule of law that exists in the region. But there's so much more that can be done, and a lot of the tangible ways that you all highlighted. So definitely agree that investment and private sector investment from the US and Japan should continue, and hopefully this will help improve these economic challenges that exist. I'd like to turn to another question we've received from our global audience. This is actually from a young global professional with the Eurasia Center. Um, so really excited to have this question here from Zahar. The questions are, do you think the middle corridor will continue being a complementary route compared to the traditional northern route going through Russia, or do you see it taking on a more primary role in trade and connectivity from east to west? And as a follow-up, how can G7 partners balance their middle corridor investments under the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment with China's Belt and Road investments to ensure both strategic advantage and regional cooperation? So definitely a lot of things to consider, a lot of a very hefty question to answer. Andrew, if I can pick on you again, since this is a question from your YGP with the Eurasia Center, let's turn it over to you for some initial thoughts here.
Sure, and I promise I didn't tell Zahar to ask this. But yeah, I think the middle corridor has developed really, really fast over the last two plus, coming up on 3 years now, in part as a hedge away from Russia while it's prosecuted its full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine, and European countries have decided that actually it's less risky to transport more of their goods through the middle corridor than through the traditional northern corridor. And so there's actually a lot of progress that's been made on in terms of cutting down transit times, increasing trade volumes, and it's been really impressive and an impressive example of coordination, not only among the Central Asian states, in principle, Kazakhstan as the linchpin of the middle corridor, but also with the South Caucasus states, with Azerbaijan and Georgia, and now with this TRIP agreement, the Trump route for international peace and prosperity through Armenia and Azerbaijan, we could see even more potential for the middle corridor simply because there will be more routes and the possibility for more throughput in the region. But the question about it being a complementary route is a good one, because the multimodality of the middle corridor does increase costs just by its very nature. You have to take things from roads, from trains onto ships, and then back on roads and trains and all the way to, and so it does add lots of steps in terms of getting goods from Asia to Europe. And so I think in the long term, the major potential for the middle corridor is as a regional transit link and transport link, rather than a grand new road between China and Europe. And this is actually a positive for Central Asia. There's lots of development that can be had simply between markets like Turkey and Central Asia. There's a lot that can be done there. And if the US is serious about rare earth development, the way that they're going to get out and back to US markets is via the middle corridor. But there are a fair few risks here. We have to be honest about that as well. Cost is one. It's still simply cheaper to send goods through Russia on one railroad to Europe. That's just a fact, and there's a lot that the Central Asian states can do, particularly Kazakhstan, to decrease costs, particularly going across the Caspian, where tariffs are quite high, shipping tariffs, that is. And then there are risks to the Caspian Sea itself. The water levels are decreasing rapidly, and this is something that Kazakhstan has had to invest in, dredging some of its ports, and this will continue to be a problem unless there's something that can be done with some of these difficult neighbors like Russia and Iran about preserving the levels of the Caspian Sea. So there are risks, but all of these risks, I would say, place a premium on the kinds of reforms and transparency mechanisms that we want to see, because efficiency will be the name of the game. And if we're talking about project economics from a US or Japanese or Western perspective, the companies will want to go in when it will be profitable for them. And there's a lot that the Central Asian states in particular, I have to shout Kazakhstan again out just because it's such a big player in the middle corridor, can do to make those efficiencies happen.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That's really helpful to kind of shed light on the what these transport routes can offer. Dr. Uyama, can we turn to you for your thoughts on this question?
Well, I think the middle corridor will continue being a complementary route. And for Japan, it's not a complementary route compared to the northern route, but complementary to the sea route, because for Japan, it's much cheaper and easier to transport goods to Europe and other western part of the Eurasian continent by sea through Indian Ocean. And it is often said that the middle corridor is expensive, not only because it's a land route, but also it crosses many borders. And again, corruption also affects the working of this corridor. But I think the middle corridor and other projects are important not only as distinct routes, but Central Asia is experiencing difficulties also in the transportation inside the region. So the more transport networks develops in various parts of the region, then the easier will be to transport goods from one country to another inside the region. And this will be important also for Japan and other countries because many companies have one or two offices in Central Asia. So it will be it will facilitate their business if transport selection of the choice of transport routes will multiply.
Thank you very much. Dr. Arinov, what are your thoughts on this question about whether the middle corridor will be a complementary route compared to the traditional northern route through Russia? And then how can G7 partners balance middle corridor investments compared against China's existing Belt and Road Initiative?
So definitely, I mean, from the Central Asian perspective, now it's the momentum for the countries to get as much as possible investments in terms of investments to the middle corridor, especially for Kazakhstan's foreign policy. The middle corridor issue is one of the toppest priorities, right? So in that sense, it's not just a temporary, I mean, from the viewpoint of Central Asian countries, it's not just a temporary investments in the context of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, but the Kazakhstan at least perceives the middle corridor as a long-term strategy. It now realized, the government now realized that relying on one kind of the partner or one neighbor when it comes to transportations is just again very risky. So in that sense, the view is that okay, we're going to be investing in middle corridor as much as possible, attracting as much as possible investments as possible. so that we have different alternatives. Just about the middle corridor, which goes through Kazakhstan and the Caspian, but also Kazakhstan is investing in the southern corridors, right? In Afghanistan, in order to get access to the through Iran or through Pakistan to the Gulf area. So that's the strategy. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge again that the middle corridor has its own limits. So it cannot entirely complement, kind of replace the northern corridor. So that in that sense, it's just one of the multiple kind of routes, which is very important at this point. As for investments, so far, it's true that China is one of the biggest players, and then the Central Asian countries are not reluctant to work even further with Chinese investments, right? For instance, the China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan railroad, which has been signed, announced. Again, I mean, I know it's a kind of long story, but still, if it materializes, it also shows, again, it's once again will show that China is the key player here. The EU has been one of the most promising kind of actors in that sense, right? Last year promising 11 billion euro, 12 billion euro investments. This year, earlier in April, announcing another kind of big investment, 10 billion investment in the region, part of which goes to the transportation. So these are important for the for Central Asian countries. And then here, of course, there is a kind of a huge space for US and Japan to complement what the EU has been kind of leading, right? If not directly, but also there are some options for multilateral kind of platforms, World Bank, ABD, and others, to put more kind of extra eye on the transportation routes. But again, we have to understand that there are some natural limits of the middle corridor when it comes to the expansion of its capacity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arinov. You touched on a lot of different points, talking about the EU as a role in the region, and then the opportunity for US and Japan to kind of complement that as well. We're unfortunately coming towards near the end of our event today, but I wanted to provide each of our panelists the opportunity to kind of share maybe one or a couple key takeaways from today that you want our audience to leave with. What do you see as the most promising opportunities for US and Japanese engagement with Central Asia going forward? So Dr. Uyama, if I can turn to you first on what you think are some key takeaways that the audience can take from today's discussion.
Well, I want to repeat that Central Asia is now quite well developed region and even more important, a stable region. So this is important in today's world when many countries and regions are experiencing turmoil. So I think Japan and the United States should see Central Asia as a partner to keep the world safe and stable. So this is not only mean that Japan and the United States should prevent Russia and China's influence, but to keep rule-oriented international order, Japan, the United States, and Central Asia can find a common interest in keeping the world stable and keeping the relation between great and smaller powers equal. So there are there is much things that we can do to keep the international order in a more stable manner than today's turmoil risks turning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated how you emphasized the rules-based international order that is important for both the US and Japan, and emphasizing regional stability of Central Asia and the importance, as we've talked about throughout today's discussion, of not neglecting small powers and the agency of individual Central Asian players. Dr. Arinov, if I can turn to you next for key takeaways that you want our audience to leave with.
Yeah, I don't want to be repeating the same points. Maybe just kind of a few reflections on the recent dynamics, geopolitical dynamics in the region. So what's been happening since 2022, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, reminds me the early 2000s. Again, the same level of attention to the region. The Central Asia has become a kind of, in the context of the war in Afghanistan, right? The Central Asia has become suddenly very important for many Western actors, not only in terms of oil, but to kind of the significance. To me, most of what is happening today, it kind of reminds me of that period. And then we know that after 10 years, that kind of attention waned, and then Central Asia lost its kind of the position of visibility in the geopolitics or in the foreign policy thinking of many Western actors. So I really hope that this time situation is different. So this time I really hope that it's not just about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's not just about U.S. competition with China. I really hope that this time we are talking about Central Asia as it is, especially when seen from the U.S. perspective, from Japan perspective, from the EU perspective. And then in that kind of regard, I really hope that probably the parties will be able to institutionalize some of those cooperation that we've been seeing in the last few years, so that we have the longer sustained dialogue cooperation where it's possible based on the interest of those parties involved. So I really hope that the situation is a bit different this time. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Arinov. Really appreciate you sharing that Central Asia should be considered in its own right, not just an extension of other geopolitical events that are taking place, and have appreciated your comments on that throughout today's discussion. Andrew, last but certainly not least, over to you for any final thoughts you want to leave our audience with.
Well, first of all, I certainly agree with Dr. Arinov that the Central Asian states and Central Asia as a region, the thesis for treating it as it on its own is much better now than it was in past years. And I think U.S. policy should, in fact, as we've all kind of said here, treat Central Asia on its own merits and develop a policy accordingly. I have four kind of quick thoughts that I want to leave folks with. Number one, U.S. policy. We need to show up more in Central Asia. We need to physically be there. Many of these countries want new partners, and like we've said throughout this whole discussion, these countries have agency and are actively looking to develop kind of new relations and deepen relations, and we can do that by making the effort ourselves. Number two is the U.S. government should focus on bridging gaps in project economics and helping facilitate investment in the region, including through things like the Development Finance Corporation and the Exim Bank and other tools to help U.S. companies enter the region and expand operations there. One thing we haven't talked about today is water security. This is something for all of the 5 Central Asian states that's quite important. And this is something that U.S. companies have the technical expertise to be really helpful with. This isn't something that Russia and China are quite as good at or care as much about, and sometimes have vested interests against. So the U.S. really is in a unique position to be a partner here. And finally, in building on that, the U.S. needs to focus on building and furthering these constructive partnerships to the extent that the U.S. can encourage and support and facilitate regional cooperation between the 5 Central Asian states. That's also a positive.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Really appreciate that you provided a concrete numbered list of actionable recommendations that the United States can take going forward to improve and enhance engagement with Central Asia. So unfortunately, we are coming to time for today's discussion, but I'd really love to, if you can join me in thanking our excellent lineup of speakers who have joined us for a really fascinating discussion, but only really scratching the surface for potential for increasing U.S. and Japanese engagement in Central Asia, which today we talked about the importance of autonomy and the individual voices of Central Asia and shaping the strategy of U.S. and Japanese engagement with each of these individual countries based on the strategic interests of each of these countries rather than considering Central Asia as a whole. I'd like to personally thank our Atlantic Council events, audiovisual, digital, and editorial teams for the support in pulling together our event today. A huge kudos goes out to our Indo-Pacific Security Initiative team and Eurasia Center team, particularly Audrey Rowe, who has made sure this event went off without a hitch behind the scenes. Thanks to you, our global audience, for your thoughtful questions throughout today's session. We really hope that you continue to remain engaged with the Atlantic Council's work. To learn more about the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative and the Eurasia Center's work, please visit our website at atlanticcouncil.org. Thank you very much for tuning in, and until next time.